Welcome to the Charismatic Cheetah podcast, exploring all things supernatural biblically. Today, my guest is Seth Vanderbrooke of Project Eleazar. We're doing a Nephilim deep dive part 2. So, obviously, if you've missed part 1, go check it out. If you're listening on an audio streaming or whatever podcast version, then the link will be in the description for part 1. But if you're watching on YouTube, I think this is top right for you. There'll be a little link up there so you can check out part 1. Go check out part 1. It's actually my top 3, my third best video that I have on the whole channel. So definitely looking forward to it. We're gonna basically talk about stuff that we didn't get into the first time, and we dove into a lot of stuff. It was very thorough, and Seth made my job really easy. He has notes, so I'm sure he'll put up on his website again like he did before. If you want to follow along with the notes, that'll be in the description as well. Before we dive in, please share this video with your grandma, your grandma's cousins, friends, baby mother, sister. Like this video, subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff. It really does support the channel, and it helps me to grow. So if you found this beneficial or edifying, or even if you think I'm a heretic, share it. I don't care. All publicity is good publicity at the end of the day. So if you want to support this channel financially, every little bit helps, whether it's $2, $3, $5, whatever, one time or monthly. There'll be a link to Patreon down in the description. There's also a Charismatic Cheetah podcast Discord. It's actually pretty active, surprisingly. That also will be in the description as well. So if you want to join the conversation, try to make myself a little more available in that space. I said. But all that stuff's in the description. And once again, like I did last week, if you need some stickers, go see my friends at Spiraling Impressions. They do some great work. And again, link will be in the description. So, Seth, thanks for coming on again, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. Thanks for having me back on. This will be fun.
Thanks for coming on, dude. Episode 1 was cool. So just real quick, for people who maybe didn't watch part 1 and they don't feel like going and go find that one, could you just tell people like who you are and about your website and your blog and all that stuff?
Yeah, so my name is Seth Vanderbrooke. If you missed the last episode, we were doing that deep dive that Michael talked about. My full-time job is working at my church answering Bible questions. We get questions from all over the world. So I just day in, day out, and answering Bible questions, which I absolutely love. And when I'm not doing that, I'm doing historical research on the Bible, but on a lot of other things. I'm just fascinated by history. And so I read a lot of old, dusty books. And when I'm doing that research, I come across a lot of strange and interesting things, a lot of which I never thought I'd be talking about or investigating. And so that's what people seem to find very interesting. So when a lot of people started asking questions, I realized, wow, this is going to take too long for me to explain it. So I started a blog. My blog is projecteleazar.com. That's where I have articles on all sorts of things, all sorts of enigmas in the Bible and in history. So you can check that out. I've got tons of articles on there that you guys can read about a lot of these topics that I'm talking today. There's probably like, I don't know, 5 or 6 that might all pertain to the things that we're talking about today. But yeah, so that's where you can find my stuff, projecteleazar.com. That's got links to everything else on my social media and all the other podcasts and things that I've been on. So that's my stuff. And today we're going to continue with talking about the Nephilim. Last time when we talked, we were trying to hit the basics of not just what the Bible says, but also what was the word on the street, the ancient word on the street. What were all the other texts outside of the Bible? What were people saying? What was the idea of what these things were, and what they looked like? What did they act like? Where they came from. We talked about the 3 different views: the Sethite view. We talked about the kingship view and the angelic view. You can go back and watch that episode. That's right. But yeah, so you can look at those, look at all the things that we talked about in that last one. There was something that I said. I was listening back over the last episode we did, and I heard myself say something, and I was like, Seth, what are you doing? That's not accurate. So I wanted to correct what I said, because I realized I had to go back and I was like, why did I say that? And I found out, I was like, okay, I copied my notes wrong. And I misspoke. And literally, as soon as I listened to it the first time, I was like, that's so dumb. Why did I say that?
Hey, if
So
it
that
makes you
all,
feel any better, Wes Huff, I'm sure you're well aware of him.
yeah,
He did an episode where he like called his own mistakes out. He went on Joe Rogan, as everyone knows.
yeah.
And he even made a lot of mistakes, not major mistakes, but like he said things wrong. So even he was like, this guy's a heretic. You know, it's kind of funny. But so if it makes you feel any better, even Wes Huff, you know, he makes mistakes
There
too.
you
So
go. Thank you. Yeah, it's easy. I know I've done it on other ones where you just say something random. And you're like, why did I say that? So yeah. So the thing that I said that was incorrect was I was talking about Deuteronomy 32 verse 17, and Psalm 106 verse 37. Those verses I said, oh yeah, where it says demon, the original word is Rephaim. The other verses I talked about, the original word is Rephaim, but those two verses don't say Rephaim. They say Shadim, which is the plural form of the Hebrew word shade. And that word shade is what they used for demons in the Old Testament. It really only shows up those two times. But that word was not Rephaim. It was shade. And that word, when you check it out, if anyone doesn't know, there's something called the Strong's Concordance. And there are other concordances, but the Strong's Concordance is one of the most popular by far. And what it is it's basically a list of all the words that are in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and it's got definitions for those words. So it's just trying to describe, okay, this is what this word is. Here's what it means for the layman, or mostly for scholars who are trying to understand, but maybe aren't experts in those languages. So the Strong's Concordance is very readily available. You can go to blueletterbible.com, type in a Strong's Concordance code or number, whatever, and it'll pull it up. And so I encourage you guys to. Is it .org?
yeah, you
There
messed
you go.
up again, man. We
Thank
got to
you.
start all over now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think they own both. I remember
Oh, okay.
typing that in and then it redirects over. I'm like, that's right. Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
get that wrong
Cool.
a lot. But yeah, so Blue Letter Bible, they have great stuff. When you put that in there, you'll be able to look at the Strong's Concordance for whatever that word is. But in this case, the word shade, like if you pull that up, and I have the link in my notes, and so you can link to that, Michael. But I've got the links to all these things that we'll be talking about. But if you check that out, you know that word for demon that's used there is shade. That's how you pronounce it, actually. It's not our word shade, but it's normally like transliterated as shed, but it's pronounced shade. And so that's what they use for more like territorial demonic spirits. People like Michael Heiser and others have talked about that in a little bit more depth, their writings and such. But why was I going to bring that verse up correctly the first time, but addressed incorrectly? The reason why that's significant is, so those are the only times that we see the word in English, demon, show up in the Old Testament. That word shade is then related in many different ways to the word Rephaim. So that's why it's significant. In fact, when you check out the Strong's Concordance number H7496 for Rephaim, because they're actually a couple for Rephaim because it's used in different ways. And Strong's Concordance is going to tell you, okay, here's the same word, but it's used in a different way. It means a different thing in this context. And so it's going to have a different number for each of those meanings. So 7496 is going to get you a definition that says ghosts of the dead, shades, and spirits. Now, this is interesting because it is the Hebrew word Rephaim, right? But it says that word shades, it says spirits, and it says ghosts of the dead. And if there's really any legitimate, strictly biblical proof text for ghosts, it would be the concept of Nephilim dying and their spirits staying. That's really kind of what we think about when it goes, right? This person dies and their spirit sticks around, right? And that was the ancient understanding, the Jewish understanding of what was going on with these Nephilim. They were dying and their spirit was sticking around. And it's interesting, of course, there's all those passages in the New Testament where ghosts come up and people are like, oh, Jesus, we thought you were a ghost,
Yeah.
And he's like, no, ghosts don't eat food. And you're like, wait, are there really ghosts? So when you look up that word, that's the definition you get. It's going to say ghost of the dead, shades, or spirits. And then if you look at 7497, the very next number, it's actually just going to say giants, Rephaim, old tribe of giants, straight up. And that's because the word is used in different ways, right? So what I was getting at previously, we were talking about how that word Rephaim was used in different ways over time. At first, it was referring to a specific tribe of giants. Then in Deuteronomy, like back in Genesis 14, you see them in this massive battle, which is super cool. And then you see in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, they're connected with, the Anakim and all these other tribes. And so when we see those connections between all those tribes and the Rephaim, and it uses this phrase, they were counted as the Rephaim, we see that now the word has started to be this catch-all term for all the giants in general. It's like they were of this category, of the category of the Rephaim. So now it's changed. And then as we continue in scripture, then later on we start to see it show up in the way that this first term, like shades and ghosts of the dead and spirits that I mentioned, 7496, in those passages where that appears, we see this in Psalm 88, verse 10, and Job 26, verse 5, Proverbs 2:18, Proverbs 9:18, Proverbs 21:16, Isaiah 14:9, Isaiah 26:14, and Isaiah 26:19. So on all those verses, it's using the word Rephaim, but in your English translation, you're not going to see the word Rephaim. You're going to see departed spirits. Depending on your translation, it'll be departed spirits, ghosts of the dead, shades, or just spirits. Most of the time, it's like departed spirits or spirits of the dead. But it will also use the English word shade, which is interesting. And so there's this connection consistently throughout, like looking at, okay, this Rephaim is a dead spirit. It's a shade. It's a demonic creature that is oftentimes they're described as either haunting the depths of Sheol or haunting destroyed cities that God is cursing. It's interesting when you do a word study on how that word Rephaim continues to show up, but it's still consistent.
Which is real interesting. I think I said this last time too. And I'm gonna have all the notes in the description so people want to follow along. But all these scriptural references you have to Rephaim, there's a lot of them. It's not just like one time in a couple verses. No, and there's a lot of people say, oh, well, why aren't the Nephilim in the Old Testament besides Genesis 6? And well, once you make the connection of Rephaim and you look at all the verses that word is in, it's like, no, there's Nephilim connection to the whole Old Testament. I just think that's
totally.
It's very fascinating, man. So
yeah, and when you connect that further, right, you say, okay, these are the Rephaim. We see all these other tribes that are counted as Rephaim, and then you continue to check all those other verses. I have it was one of my earlier blog posts where I lay out all the different names and tribes and count all of them up. And there's over 800 references.
Wow, that's a lot.
To tribes, that had giants, or specific specific giants that are named. So it's all over the place. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
800 is a lot of verses. So once you break that door down and you realize, okay, the word Nephilim shows up twice, right? Genesis 6:4, Numbers 13:33. But the concept shows up everywhere, like all over the place. And when you start digging into what those verses are saying about these spirits, you start realizing, oh, there's this progression where at first they're giants, then they're spirits, and then these are the spirits that idols are being made for, that are being worshipped, that God is saying over and over again. He says, I will destroy remembrance of them, or I have destroyed remembrance of them. And I remember reading that the first time I was studying it, and I was like, what is it? Why does he keep emphasizing that he's going to remove remembrance of them? And that's because remembrance of your ancestors was this part of ancestral veneration. So the idea was that you were going to venerate the dead spirits, and in that way kind of bring them back to life. Not like actually bring them back to life. But the idea was that you were keeping their memory alive and almost feeding their spirit. How palpably true that is, I don't know. But it was still a form of veneration that the Lord clearly did not like and was like, no, I'm going to put a stop to this. And so that's why he keeps saying, I'm going to destroy the remembrance of them. These guys are worthless. These guys are powerless compared to me, which is absolutely true. So
what we would call demons today, what Paul, when he's talking to the Corinthians and he's talking about what they sacrifice to demons.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same. Basically, he could have said, if he was talking to maybe to a Jewish audience primarily, maybe would he have used used the word Rephaim instead? So like interchangeable words.
Possibly. I mean, we don't have any record of him doing that. But it's very possible. Like that would have made sense. Now his his terminology, he makes it clear, and I'm going to show actually a connection specifically to that. He makes it clear, many others do as well in the early church. We have a lot of writings from people in the early church that are explicitly making this connection. And they're saying, what you're worshiping aren't gods, they're demons. And a lot of these demons are, in fact, kings that did live and died and are now here.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, some early church fathers literally named them and say, yes, Saturn was a person, but he wasn't a god. And then he died, and now he is a god. And you're like, wait, why would you say it like that? And he's like, well, because it's not that they're actually gods. It's that they're trying to say, it's confusing. You know, you change it to English, and all of a sudden the word God sounds wrong. And you're like, but they're not gods. Yes, but in their language, their word made sense for that, right? So it's like, now they're a spirit being, and now that's what you're worshiping. And yeah, it has power, but nothing compared to the power of Christ. And so they were constantly trying to continue basically the work that Paul was doing and saying, like, no, we're not saying those things don't exist. We're saying they do exist, and that's the problem. Don't worship those things. Worship God, because he's actually the creator. He's actually the one that created everything. And that's part of what's really been a fascinating journey for me, is seeing that there's this consistent thread where both the Jews and the Christians were trying to tell the world, hey, there is this connection. Like, we're not saying those things don't exist. In fact, I mean, that was the problem. The Jews kept worshiping those things too. So they believed him. But in reality, it was this, the Bible is this polemic, right? It's this writing that is writing against the contemporary narrative of its day, of each of those books that were written, right? It's writing against their modern narrative and saying, hey, you believe in this God and that God and that God. Guess what? Those aren't what they claim they are. They're actually fallen angels, or they're disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. Both of those would count in this kind of negative category of demonic spirits. So that thread, seeing that there's a consistent understanding that there are ties between the mythologies of other nations and the biblical writings, is interesting, and it's slept on. Now these days, I'm encouraged to see it is kind of a growing understanding. A lot more people are talking about it, and they're realizing, because of largely because of the Nephilim. I feel like that's kind of the, blurry creatures.
Michael
they
Heiser.
joke about, blurry creatures. They joke about Bigfoot being the gateway drug. And I feel like a lot of ways the Nephilim are the kind of the gateway drug for understanding that. And yes, Michael Heiser does a great job of laying those things out, and there are many others as well. And it's funny because a lot of people will be like, oh, well, Michael Heiser's just one guy, where are we listening to him? It's like, nothing in his book was like his idea. He's quoting other scholars, and sometimes I think people forget that. Other scholars are saying this, and then he was making it public to the layman. Scholars are already talking about it. But anyways, so all that to say, let's look at some of these texts that continue to build on that narrative and clarify what's going on. I already mentioned Isaiah 26, verses 13 through 14. I'm just going to read this real quick. It says, "O Lord our God, other lords beside you have ruled over us." Like, wait a second. Wait, what? Like, you mean who? Like, what's going on? It says, "But your name alone we will bring to remembrance." That's interesting. So we're only going to venerate you, Lord. That's good. This is exactly what he's been telling them to do. Stop venerating, these other lords. But who are these other lords? Well, it says they are dead. Wait, these lords are dead? How are they over you? It says they are dead. They will not live. They are shades. They will not rise. To that end, you have visited them to destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. And now in this verse, it is talking about the Rephaim in this situation. And when it's connecting this, and so is Isaiah 14:9, where it says the spirits of the dead, where in that verse it says Sheol from beneath is excited over you to meet you when you come. It arouses for you the spirits of the dead, Rephaim, all the leaders of the earth. It rises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. So these passages are making an explicit connection between the kings of old, right? These men of renown, these kings of old who died and then were venerated. And now they're saying, but you devoted them to destruction. Lord, you destroyed them and have wiped out the veneration of them, the remembrance of them. It's not that they didn't remember them. Obviously, they're talking about them right now. But it's that he's wiped out the veneration of those spirits. As Isaiah 14:9 says, the spirits of the dead in English. And that word Rephaim, the translators are accurately translating that to say, well, in this context, Rephaim is referring to these undead spirits that are still lingering around. And the early church understood this connection. We're not just making this up or forcing, definitions or anything like that. Commodianus, who was an early one of the many early church writers and authors, and I almost said historian, but like church father, he wrote about this and a lot of other things. But here's a little excerpt from his writing Instructions, where he was trying to instruct the early church. He said in chapter 3 of Instructions, he says, "When Almighty God, to beautify the nature of the world, willed that the earth should be visited by angels." This is interesting. In the beginning of the Genesis 6 narrative, he interprets it as the Lord sent the angels down at first. He was already sending them down. Now, whether that's 100% true, I don't know, but that was his interpretation, which is interesting. He said, when they were sent down, they despised his laws. So he viewed it as they were sent down first, and then they decided, we don't like the Lord's laws, so that now they're falling. Then he says, such was the beauty of women that it turned them aside. So he's saying, okay, what turned them aside from the law? It's like, well, they saw the women and they were like, they look pretty nice. I don't know if the Lord's laws are as, are all that great. And what he's implying here is that they understood this was off limits, right? Like they knew this was wrong, which I think every interpretation of this that recognized them to be angels certainly understands. He said that turned them aside so that, being contaminated, they could not return to heaven. It's interesting that he uses that word contamination, right? And so he sees that as they get corrupted and contaminated by that sexual intercourse with these women. And now the Lord's like, hey, you can't return home.
Kind of like when Jude says that the angels, they left their proper dwelling type of thing.
Right. They left their abode. Yeah. Or their domain, depending on your translation. Right. They left their proper dwelling. They came down and now they're stuck. It's like, oh, yeah. You can't come back now. Yeah. So then he says, rebels from God, they uttered words against him. Then the highest, the Lord, uttered his judgment against them. And from their seed, giants are said to have been born. By them, arts were made known in the earth, like different arts for like crafting things and doing different stuff, which he says, and they taught the dyeing of wool and everything which is done. And to them, when they died, men erected images. Now, he just says it briefly. He mentions like dyeing wool and everything which is done. Everything which is done is so broad, right? But when you read any of the other guys that go into detail about, and this and this and that, which we will read a little bit from Justin Martyr, but also things like First Enoch, Jubilees, both chapter 7, and both of those, like they'll talk about, here are all the things that these fallen angels taught humanity, and almost all of them were just blatantly evil. Some of them were, ironically, somewhat practical, but most of what they were, teaching them. Because we looked at like, what's wrong with dyeing wool? Like what's so bad about that? And we won't need to get into that. But a lot of these things, the Jews and Christians did look at as, hey, this is demonic origins. Warfare and idolatry was, like, from their understanding, literally taught by demons. So people are like, I don't understand. Why did people just make up these gods and just start worshiping things that didn't exist? It's like, well, things that existed came down and told them to do so.
And drugs,
that was their
well.
Understanding.
Like drugs.
Yeah, well, that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of what they do is like, you do that, right? You get on drugs and then you see something that tells you to do something. Yeah. It's like, what do you think that was? That was demonic, right? And I mean, I know people who unfortunately have done that and are now Christians and are like, yeah, that was demonic. Like, I didn't know it at the time, but that's what I saw. So it's a thing. Don't mess with it, guys.
No, don't.
So, yeah, please don't. So he then says, like, and men erected images, right? So now they're erecting images about who? The Nephilim, the giants. Then he says, but the Almighty, because they were of an evil seed, did not approve that. when dead, they should be brought back from death. And you're like, brought back from death? What? This is the veneration, right? This is venerating them back. So it's the idea is we venerate them, we build an idol, and then we perform a ritual that invites the spirit of that Nephilim into, it's called the opening of the mouth ceremony, right? Into this idol. And now there's a, lowercase g God in there that we can give stuff to, make deals with, and will protect us.
Yeah.
And unfortunately that happened. He then says, whence wandering they now subvert many bodies, so that's with possession, and it is such as these especially that ye this day worship and pray to as gods. So he just says it flat out. It's like, guys, these are the things that you think are gods, right? And this totally connects with 1 Corinthians 10, 19 through 20, where Paul says, what do I imply then? This is like what you mentioned, Michael. What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to gods. I do not want you to be participants with demons. In chapter 8, he mentions it as well, and he talks about he's like, there are many gods and many lords in heaven and on earth. So he does talk about these lowercase g gods as existing and as being bad. And over here, he's later on, same letter, he explicitly says they are demons. In case in case this isn't clear, these are demons. So he's so this is sound teaching that we're getting from these early church writings. They understood the context. It was there. Paul's writing like right around this time. Now it's earlier. It's earlier than the writing we just wrote. Right. That's from the 3rd century AD. But relatively speaking, it's much closer in time, temporal proximity, and culturally. And so they got all this stuff. It wasn't a secret. It's harder for us because we don't have that context, but these guys did. Another example would be Justin Martyr. And I know
real quick, I want to just touch on something just real quick on the on the where it talks about now whence wandering they now subvert many bodies. One of the things that like demonization, demon possession. I don't really like the demon possession word, but demonization. You look at in the Gospels, and it's like it seems like it's so like this is different than the Old Testament. This didn't happen in the Old Testament, but when you dive into writings such as this, writing Second Temple literature, even First Enoch, and you understand that the demons are the spirits of the departed Nephilim, they're Rephaim, then you understand why demon possession, demonization was a thing, because they want bodies to possess again. For me, it didn't quite make sense that fallen angels would want to possess a limited human being. You know what I mean? Just to hurt ourselves. I just didn't. But when you really see it for what it actually is in its context, and you're like, oh, that makes sense. If I died and didn't have a body anymore, but I was doomed to roam the earth, thirsty, and like Enoch says, then I'm gonna try to be as much of a human as I can. I'm gonna go into somebody's body and start, living out my own desires, my own, not really flesh, because I'm a dead spirit. But so I just think it's really interesting when you start looking into this. It makes other things in the New Testament and the Old Testament make a lot of more sense. So I just wanted to touch on that before we move on to the next part. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really the benefit with a lot of these things. I understand a lot of people can be like, well, why are you wasting your time studying this? Isn't this a distraction from the truth of the gospel? How is this helpful? And ultimately, my response is, well, it's only helpful if you want to understand the Bible. It's only helpful if you want to better understand a lot of the passages that are really confusing, that don't really line up or make sense. A lot of the things that people accuse, oh, well, this is being contrary, or this doesn't make sense in the Bible. It's like, it doesn't make sense because you don't understand the supernatural context. You might have dug into some of the historical context, but you don't understand the supernatural context. And when you do, it makes perfect sense. It's not even confusing in the slightest. And when all those books were written to the people of that time, they had the context. It made perfect sense. There was no confusion. It's harder for us. So there is benefit to understanding these things. It helps you understand, like you said, both the Old and New Testament, explains what's going on. And there are times, I mean, the only time that we see explicitly a fallen angel possess a person is the devil possessing Judas, right?
Oh yeah.
So that does happen, but that's the only time that we see that strictly. Now we do see in the Old Testament an implied, either it's possession or it's just that the entity is like supporting and behind the kings of of old, right? So like
Yeah.
in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, in those passages where, it's traditionally understood that that's the devil was behind those kings. And so God is speaking to the king, but also to the demonic entity behind the king. So there's definitely a relationship there. Now, whether or not they're possessed totally, we don't know. It doesn't really say, but it's possible. It's possible. So either way, that's kind of that connection there. So Justin the Martyr in Second Apologies, chapter 5. This is kind of common with people will point to Justin the Martyr as well as Josephus. These guys kind of go hand in hand for showing that both the Gentiles and the Jews did understand that these were angels, that these were giants. This is what we're talking about. But I'm going to read a little more than what I feel like most people read, because he gives some interesting context going further into this demonic relationship here. So he says in chapter 5, but if this idea take possession of someone, that if we acknowledge God as our helper, we should not, as we say, be oppressed and persecuted by the wicked, this too I will solve. God, when he made the whole world and subjected earthly things to man and arranged heavenly elements for the increase of fruits and rotation of the seasons, he's talking about the stars and everything, and appointed this divine law, for these things also he evidently made for man, committed the care of men and of all things under the heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. So now he's saying he appointed these angels over mankind over all these things of creation. It's made for mankind, and then angels are appointed over them. And then he says, but the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by the love of women and begot children, who are those that are called demons. Straight up. It's just like, not only did they beget these giant children, right, but they were demons. Then he says, and besides, they afterwards subdued the human race to themselves, partly by magical writings, and partly by fears and the punishments they occasioned, and partly by teaching them to offer sacrifices and incense and libations, of which things they stood in need after they were enslaved by lustful passions. So it is, it's like with both of these things, the demonic name, and the teachings, these were applied to both the children and the fathers, right? Both were teaching, both were doing wicked things, and both were demonic. He goes on to talk about, he says, lustful passions, and among men they sowed murders and wars and adulteries, intemperate deeds, and all wickedness, which was the common understanding. When they look at Genesis 6, they're not just like people started doing bad stuff. They're like demons came down and started encouraging people to do horrible things they never even thought about doing yet.
Yeah.
And that's where all this wickedness really comes from, and it grows and it grows and it gets horrendous. He then says, whence also the poets and mythologists, not knowing that it was the angels and those demons who had been begotten by them that did these things to men and women and cities and nations, when they related, ascribed them to God himself. So what is he saying? He's literally saying, hey guys, the poets and all these people who tell the mythologies of the pagan nations, what they're talking about, they didn't realize that these were fallen angels, these were demonic entities. And so they understood them to be gods. And so thus you get all of the, thus you get Homer, thus you get all these writings, and they're viewing these gods as more or less positive. Now, you read, Greek mythology, it's no secret the gods aren't all that great, right? But they did still worship them as great at the same time, right? They saw their flaws, but they also saw this positive side, and they're like, oh, but they're really good, we should still worship them. And a lot of it was fear, and that's what's interesting, right? Because that's connected back to what he had just said. He said a lot of their worship was out of fear because they were punishing them if they didn't. Of course, that's his understanding, right? Scripture doesn't say that explicitly, but that's his understanding from other writings as well. So he lays all of that out, and then he says, ascribe to God himself, and to those who were accounted to be his very offspring, and to the offspring of those who were called his brothers, Neptune and Pluto, and to the children again of their offspring. for whatever name each of the angels had given to himself and his children by that name, they called them. So he's claiming, Justin Martyr is claiming that the names that people used, like he mentions Neptune and Pluto, were picked by the angels themselves. They picked new names and they said, this is my name. That's interesting. Picked themselves because we know that like when God created things, he named them, right?
Yeah.
We also know it says like God knows the name of every star in the sky, and there's all this relationship between stars and angels. So God knew the names of the angels, and the angels came down, they changed their names. That's a low blow.
Yeah.
They changed their names, and it's by those names that unfortunately even our culture is littered with, right?
Yeah.
Apollo this, Athena that, like Zeus this, like it. Those names are still everywhere, and people still use them. It's common, and so they came down, they picked their own names, which is interesting, right? He's claiming, look, the Greeks didn't just come up with a story they felt like coming up with. They were told a story, and the names that they're using are literally the names that these angels chose. Now, that's at least what he's claiming.
What also is interesting about that is, God had Adam name all the animals.
Right.
That was kind of Adam being the vice regent of Earth.
Absolutely.
He's naming, and as you know, naming back then was considered like taking dominion over something. You name it, and now you have dominion over that, kind of expanding Eden. So the fact that the angels or that these Rephaim and Nephilim, they named themselves, it's kind of a low-key subversion of mankind's rightful place on the earth. Like we're supposed to be the vice regents of Earth, not these fallen sons of God and these Nephilim and these Rephaim. So that's a really interesting connection too. I never thought about that.
Yeah, they name themselves. So they're taking possession of themselves now. They're saying, I don't belong to God, I belong to myself, which is totally the thing that we fall prey to as well.
Oh, yeah.
And then they start naming other stuff and teaching things like, hey, this is what a sword is, right? So now they're making and naming and claiming and teaching these wicked practices. So yeah, so this is a good example of what a lot of early church writers were saying. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there are no opposing arguments, but all the opposing arguments were in the extreme minority. Over time, you see things shift, especially as the Catholic Church grows and they start pushing the Sethite view and eradicating a lot of these perspectives, and even the Jews, interestingly enough, because a lot of these things point to Jesus. And so they start shifting their own understanding of Scripture, and you can literally see all these old texts say a very clear understanding, and then all of a sudden the Jews are like, "Well, are we sure those were angels?" And you're like, "What?" So it's interesting. They start stepping away from it as well, even though it was a long tradition of understanding exactly that these were angels. And I mean, they're backing away from it, but Peter and Jude don't. Like in our Bible, it's very clear. Like they're laying that out, very very straightforward. So another example we have is on the Jewish side, right? Josephus, kind of a classic person that people will point to for a good understanding of that same early church period, but not from a Christian view, from a Jewish perspective. So he wrote in Antiquity of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 3. He said, and this is at the beginning of chapter 3, he says, now this posterity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe. So he's saying, Seth is born, he has his children, they're esteeming the Lord, and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations, but in the process of time, they were perverted and forsook the practices of their forefathers, and did neither pay those honors to God, which were appointed them, nor had they any concern to do justice towards men. So this is interesting because people who point to the Sethite view say, oh, no, this was the righteous marrying the wicked. And Josephus is saying, no, this is the righteous turned wicked. That's a very different perspective. He said, no, the Sethites weren't good anymore. They were also being perverted, right, by these fallen angels. And he goes on to say that. He says, but for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God to be their enemy. For, it's like, well, why? What started this? For many angels of God accompanied with women, and begot sons that proved unjust, and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence that they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants. So he's also making a direct correlation with, hey guys, this is where the Greeks are getting their understanding of the giants, the gigantes, right? This is where all these mythologies are coming from. But in reality, these weren't heroes. These weren't good guys. These were these literal demon spawn, right? But it's interesting because he's making this connection again consistently with the Greco-Roman mythologies. They're validating aspects of them and then speaking against them. Okay, so that's to like recap some of the things we talked about, build on some of the things we talked about, show some more proof of that. Before I go to the next point, I wanted to recap. Last time we talked just a little bit about First Enoch 7 and how it describes more than just the Nephilim. It says the giants that they begot giants, the great giants, and Nephilim bore the Eliud. And Jubilee says a similar thing, uses slightly different names, but instead of calling Eliud, says the Eljo. And so they're describing these three races and kind of summing it up with the term Nephilim. We pointed to the fact that Rephaim are kind of using that way, right? Counted as Rephaim. Well, apparently Nephilim was kind of used that way too. That was a bit of a catch-all term, which makes sense because as far as we understand, it's still a little debated, but as far as we understand, it comes from the root word meaning to fall. So Nephilim meaning the people who are fallen. That doesn't mean fallen angels. Literally nobody thought that in the ancient days.
Yeah,
they knew it was referring to these giants. Some people mistake that. But yeah, so the understanding was these were fallen creatures. They're like as fallen as fallen can be. That's what it was referring to in that meaning, as far as we can tell. We don't actually technically fully know. But that's what we're pretty sure about. So that term was a catch-all term. The idea is that there was diversity. A lot of these texts are talking about diversity. And we mentioned, even Josephus talks about diversity. In the same writing, he says in Book 5, Chapter 2, Section 3, he says, there were also then a race of giants whose bodies were so large and countenances were so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. So he's saying they don't look human and they didn't sound human. They looked completely different. And they were massive. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not just these guys were tall, right? We also talked about the Book of Giants, 4th Qumran 531, Fragment 2, how it talks about, when it's talking about them being born, it says they gave birth to giants and monsters. So there was this diversity. It wasn't just like tall people. There were a lot of physical deformities. We see in 1 Chronicles 20 that some of them had 6 fingers, 6 toes. There's more stuff going on. Which brings me to the kind of crescendo thing I wanted to talk about tonight, which was that the Nephilim giants were understood to be these hybrid monstrous races. There was a lot of diversity, and I've done podcasts talking about the monstrous races. I have articles talking about the monstrous races. You can read things like St. Augustine wrote about them in City of God, his book City of God, book 16, chapter 8. Pliny the Elder wrote about them. Some scholars refer to them as the Plinian races, but there's this consistent concept throughout history of these monstrous races. And some of them are wild descriptions. It's like people with their faces in their chest, or people with one leg. They're actually really fast, oddly enough. People who are really short but have magical powers, or people who have all these random, you'll notice like the consistency is deformity. And when you dig into it, at least half, if not the majority, of a lot of those deformities that they're talking about, even though a lot of them sound insane, are real deformities that still exist. Mm-hmm. So once you recognize that, you're like, well, hold on, there's something to this, right? These deformities do exist. We still have medical terms for them. So then maybe there's something to this, right? Maybe something's actually going on. And when you see that a lot of these authors are connecting things back to the giants, and then you see the Catholics are also catching on, and there's some of their writings are saying, yeah, actually this started around, like Nuremberg Chronicle talks about, hey, around the time of Tower of Babel and the division of tongues is when we start seeing some of these monstrous races start popping up, which I personally believe, it can't know for sure, but I personally believe that it was around the time of the Tower of Babel when we end up getting, just shortly after, when we end up getting, I think there was a second incursion where a different group of angels came down. Some people think it was just genetically through the line of Ham. I lean towards second incursion theory for a lot of reasons that we won't get into.
Me too.
Yeah. So that's what I think. but something that I think will just kind of open our eyes to this concept, because you look at that and you go, okay, but Greek mythology, all these monstrous races, like really, like dog people, goat people, things like that. There's no way that those things existed, right? But I mean, how crazy is it that angels had children? I mean, that's already pretty bonkers.
Yeah, that's
the idea
wild.
is that when they did, think about what a lot of these angels look like. They look insane. They look crazy, right? You have things with the heads of bulls, and it's like, and that thing had a child, you know? What do you think it looks like, right?
Yeah.
And so what we see is in scripture alone, we can actually see some of this stuff appear. And there isn't going to be a linguistic thing tying it to the Nephilim, but it's the only concept that contextually can answer the question of where these things come from. Classic example would be satyrs, goat people, or as they're referred to in most modern English translations of the Bible, goat demons. In Leviticus 17:7, it says, and this is crazy because this is a law by God, right? This isn't some poetic metaphor, right? It's a law. And he says, they shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the goat demons, with which they play the harlot. This shall be a permanent statute to them throughout their generations. This is to the Israelite people. So you're like, whoa, hold on. And I had someone ask me this recently. Someone stopped me and was like, hey, what are these goat demons? And I guess they hadn't, heard me talk about it or whatever. And they're like, what are these goat demons? What is a goat demon? I was like, well, actually, you look at that root word, you study it, and you find out it's talking about satyrs. I think literally it means hairy or hairy one. But that understanding, when you pull it up, you look at that Strong's Concordance number, H8163, it will pull up and it will say he goat, satyr, and sometimes demon. So you look at that and you're like, okay, so what is this goat demon? Clearly the translators understood this was demonic. And part of the reason why is because Greek and Latin translations of this text almost always used daimonia. Use the word for demon there. And they would just insert it. They were like, to be clear, like this is a demonic entity, right? Not in this passage, but in the one I'm about to mention. So in Isaiah 34, verse 14, it says, the desert creatures will meet with the wolves. This is God pronouncing a judgment over Babylon. Once it's destroyed, this will happen. The desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The hairy goat will also cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there and will find herself a resting place. King James says in that same verse, the wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there and find herself a place of rest. So what's going on in this verse? This verse is actually crazy. When you start looking at the original linguistics of this verse, it's crazy stuff going on here. These are three demonic, chimeric entities that God is saying will haunt the destroyed Babylon. How do we know that? Dig into those words, guys. Look, do a word study on what's going on there. The first one, when it says wolves, is actually kind of the most mysterious of the three. Satyrs is actually pretty straightforward. That hairy goat, we know that that's talking about. It's the same word used in Leviticus 17:7. Same word used in other Jewish writings where they're talking about satyrs. But the wolves, or sometimes it says hyenas, sometimes it says jackals.
Yeah,
it really means like these howlers. Yeah, is what your translation says. Yeah. So they're different. Most of them tend to be dog-like. Hyenas, I think, is an interesting one. But in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and I really want to keep researching this, but it's fascinating. It actually, both in the Greek and then later on in the Latin translation, they actually use the word centaur there, which is completely unlike a dog. So I'm not sure how that's related, but they did understand it to be like this mythical kind of creature, right? This chimeric hybrid of part animal, part humanoid, part, demonic creature. Satyr, obviously, half goat person, person with the horns and hair and all that stuff. And then the night monster, or the screech owl, which is really the proper word, Lilith, right? Capital L. That Lilith character, she's this demon. Oh, there's so many messed up things these days talking about, oh, Lilith was the first wife. No, she wasn't the first wife of Adam. That's really like that folklore came way, way, way after anything legitimate. But anyway, all that to say, she is a demon. she does exist, unfortunately, and there's plenty of lore and stuff about her. But the Bible really only mentions her and just says she's there and she's going to hunt Babylon. We don't get any other description of her, but she's part of God's like pronouncement of judgment on Babylon. And so what we have here, she's understood. There are different versions of her. Some believe she's part snake and some believe she was part owl. But either way, again, a mixture of animal and human hybrid. And so if you ask the question like, well, where did she come from? How does this make any sense? Well, she would have been the disembodied spirit of Nephilim, which is a helpful explanation for how there could be goddesses, because scripturally we see no evidence of there ever being female angels. And there being female angels would kind of go against the concept that Jesus points out in Luke 20:34-36, where he's like, no, like angels don't need to marry. There's no reason for angels to marry because they live forever. And so when you're resurrected, you're not going to marry either. Now I understand that you could say, oh, but that doesn't mean there can't be. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying we have no scriptural reason to believe that they exist. They never show up. They're never mentioned. And they seem to be incongruent with the understanding of the purpose of the angels. And they're just not supposed to procreate. So it's like, what do you have two genders for? But yeah, so understanding Lilith does give us a little bit more of an understanding of, okay, if she's Nephilim in origin, that does explain what this concept of goddesses could come from. That it could be that there are these female demonic entities, but it's because they're disembodied spirits in Nephilim.
Never thought about the goddesses thing. I just kind of, I don't know. Yeah. I guess I default thought, well, it's just demons pretending to be females, you know. But I never thought about that. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, I that's something that I think bothered me, and I was like, how does this make it? Why? Like, what's going on? But it kind of makes sense when you put those things together. So the last quote I'll use here is so we just showed in scripture it talks about these creatures. They show up many times, and they're affirmed to exist there. Now I know that maybe some people who are really motivated to act like they don't exist, and maybe they're just something else. Maybe it's just a mean goat. There's some people who really go out of their way to make linguistic arguments that they aren't satyrs. But historically, you take the context into consideration, everybody understood that to be what's going on, both pagan and otherwise. One example I have here is, this is not pagan, but it's from the summary of Philostorgius by Photius. You know, fun little names there.
Say that again. Yeah, 5 times.
I know, right? 5 times fast. Yeah. So this summary by Photius, who was, you know, more or less an early or maybe later-ish church father. He wrote a lot of stuff, but in this summary, he was writing to his fellow scholar. This guy was the patriarch of Constantinople. He was kind of a big deal, and so he was writing this stuff for his friend, who's giving him a summary of what Philostorgius was talking about. And he wrote a lot more, but this little excerpt says, of this kind is the deity called Pan, who resembles a goat in his head, face, and horns, and from his middle downward, while in his breast, his belly, and his hands, he is almost perfectly ape. Now, the word ape there is interesting. He's using it to refer to a humanoid form. And if you read the rest of what he's saying, that's very clear, because he calls things that are not ape-like apes. He's just trying to get to this humanoidish form. He then says, one of these animals was sent by the king of the Indians as a present to the emperor. So he's talking about a satyr here. He says, to the emperor Constantine, it lived a little while and was carried about as a sight, enclosed in a cage on account of its ferocity. After its death, those who had the care of it embalmed its body in salt for the purpose of turning the strange sight to account. So they're trying to preserve it in some way with the salt. And they took it safe and entire to Constantinople. It seems to me that the Greeks must once upon a time have seen this monster, and amazed at the strangeness of its appearance, adopted it as a god, in accordance with their ordinary practice of making a god out of everything strange and wonderful. This they clearly did in the case of the satyr, which is of the ape tribe, with a red face and restless motion, and furnished with a tail. Now, I think it's really interesting that he says the red, like the red hair. People will get into that with the Nephilim
Oh
and
yeah,
everything,
for sure. Yeah.
enjoy those connections.
Esau
But yeah,
too.
so right, Esau. So what's
Yeah.
interesting here is that he's literally like, this thing is real. He's not like, oh, maybe they exist. He's like, oh, like I've seen this. It's real. They probably made up Pan based on this very real satyr that exists. And you'll find a lot of writings like this in history where people are talking about these satyrs as if they're completely real, and they're using it as a side point for some larger argument or discussion, which I find fascinating, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
there's no motivation to be, they're not trying to tell a large tale. They're just this random side point for, oh, like of the list of things, here's this thing. And, oh, and this kind of helps my argument or whatever. So that's fascinating. And you can dig, this is just I'm pointing with a broad brush and pointing just a couple of sources, but there's so much stuff like this to show that historically people understood that these things existed. And so when you start breaking down that door and you realize that goat people actually existed according to the Bible, and tons of historians from different religions, with different cultural backgrounds, different languages, and they're all talking about this stuff being a thing, just like with the giants, just like with the flood, this consistent narrative, you realize, hey, there were these demonic, chimeric creatures, part human, part demon, part animal-looking crazy things that really did exist. And this explains a lot of why there are some crazy sights and encounters when people have demonic experiences. Satyrs they get so interwoven with the understanding of what a demon is that eventually this is how we get like the Catholic and modern understanding of why do demons have horns? Why do you could trace the stuff back. It's well known by scholars that this is where the concept comes from, and it all can be traced back to Genesis 6, right? Which is kind of crazy, but it can all be traced back to these monstrous races coming from this Nephilim descendants. And so all that to say, the Nephilim were not just big people. They were demonic. They looked very different, according to pretty much everybody who wrote about them. They looked very different than humanity. Some looked more human, but there was so much variety. There was so much stuff going on. And this is where we get a lot of the mythologies, a lot of the folk tales, a lot of the different understandings of the ancient world. I really do believe that there's more truth than we give credit to a lot of the ancient historians that we now treat as mythologists. We say, oh, well, that was just a story. It's like, well, he claims it was true. So either call him a liar or say there might be something to what he's saying, but don't just call him a nice author because he didn't claim to write a nice story, And I say that vaguely because that applies to a lot of different people, but that is the idea.
Yeah, dude, this is a lot there.
Yeah.
Also, kind of tying into the centaur thing is, from and Mike Heiser goes into this. I'm sure anyone who's read his stuff, but if you haven't, go check out Michael Heiser's stuff, his books, and he's on a million different podcasts. But he talks about the Transfiguration likely being near where the god of Pan was worshipped,
right, on Mount Hermon,
like the
Caesarea
gates
Philippi.
of hell, right? And that's where he talks to Caesarea Philippi. I'm not speaking in tongues, I promise. So that's also an interesting connection, is that Jesus decided to transfigure there at that time, and then say that the gates of hell aren't going to prevail against the kingdom of God. So that's also a really interesting connection. Well, so we're already at an hour, man. So I don't know. Maybe, I know you kind of already touched on it a little bit, but maybe just give, again, why this is important. It just, besides that it's fun. And a lot of people like myself, I love looking at this stuff, like the weirder, the better. But there's also a purpose to a lot of it too. So why is this important? Why does this matter? We've already touched on it a little bit, but maybe go in a little bit more. And then also maybe where can people keep digging into this material if they're like, hey man, I got a taste of this. This is awesome. Where can I learn more? So
yeah, I never thought I'd say this, but a big reason why this matters is because people are starting to worship the pagan gods again. And not that it fully stopped, but that it's growing again. It's like taking hold again. There are kids that I know, like high schoolers, that are coming to me and saying, how do I witness to my friend because she's building altars and she is sacrificing to gods? And or like, hey, how do I witness to this friend because they said, hey, I prayed to God and he didn't answer, but when I prayed to Athena, I heard a voice. And you're like, don't do that. Those are demons, right? But why does it matter? Because the more you understand these things, you can genuinely meet these people where they're at and say, hey, I know you're not crazy. Because what they're thinking is, everyone thinks I'm crazy, but what I've experienced is real, which means everyone else is wrong and I'm right. But when you're able to walk up and, like Paul, say, I know that what you're worshiping is a thing. I know it exists. I'm telling you it's evil, and I can prove it to you. Speak the name of Jesus and see what happens to your God. See how it likes that, because it's not going to like that. That is a huge deal. I don't think people realize how big of a deal that is. If we understand what really happened, if we understand the context, if we understand the diversity of the Nephilim and of spiritual beings, and of the fact that this is where a lot of these demonic things come from, then we're way better equipped to be able to witness, to be able to come alongside people and provide legitimate, historical answers to these things and biblical answers, and be like, yeah, I understand that's what you believe in, and I get why. Here's my stance, and this is why. And I've had such better responses from that. I've been amazed at how again, this was not something that I was like, I'm going to go study this thing and go on podcasts and talk about it. That wasn't my intention. But it's amazed me that people have reached out to me who worship other gods. They've reached out to me and they've said, hey, like, I have more questions because I'm worshiping these things. Hey, I believe that aliens are really the people who created everything, like whatever. There's tons of and there's a lot of people from each category that I've been blessed to talk to and have conversations. And the only reason they're listening to me is because I said things that they already knew were real. But I was one of the only Christians they ever heard who said, yeah, I get it. And I can show you from this text to that text and show those connections. So when we understand these things, it allows us to actually witness to people in a way that just other people aren't. But also, it helps us understand what's actually going on in the Bible and have a deeper, it really does enrich the understanding. Like you said, there are connections to things, tons of connections, all this stuff, and what Jesus did. It enriches the whole biblical narrative. There's nothing in the Bible that if you understand a verse better, you're not going to walk away better for it, right?
Right.
And so there's total benefit for that. And also, third point would just be that it enriches your understanding of the world as it actually is. It enlightens you. It's not about Gnosticism, where it's not about, if you understand. No, it's just about understanding the world a little bit more from a truly biblical perspective and historical perspective. When you study these things, you're going to better understand. And here's the thing: I'm not encouraging everybody to go study this stuff. Like, you don't need to study this stuff, but I do encourage you to study the Bible. Read stuff by early church fathers. I mean, you'll run into the stuff anyway. It's not like I'm encouraging people go and read, the weird stuff. Do it if you want, right? But that's not what's beneficial. Read scripture first. Have Christ at the center, and then if you find it interesting, sure, have fun. But always have the Lord first and foremost. And then where do you go if you want to dig into more of this stuff? There are a lot of resources. I'm just going to plug my own website, but if you go to my website, I have a resources page. You can go there, and I have links to tons of resources. Any of my articles, I link to all the resources, so you can see those things. I'll release my article for this one. I'll have all the notes for this podcast, and you can look at those things. If you go to those websites, you will find a bazillion other resources. So you go to pseudepigrapha.com, earlychristianwritings.com. Any of those places, you'll find a whole lot of stuff. The Perseus, I don't remember the whole website name, but if you look up the Perseus Project, they have tons of old writings that you can read for free, more than you probably have time to read. And so you can go and you can read stuff through there. I mean, there's tons of options.
New Advent's
for you
a great resource.
New Advent, yep, totally.
Yeah,
New Advent,
great
yeah.
resource,
There are a lot. Or, what's the other one? There's a handful. There's one I forgot. Sacred Text, I think. Sacredtext.com. something like that. You can look that up. So that one has a lot. There's tons of stuff out there, but do your research. And I would just encourage you, if you are researching these things, double check your sources and do your best to find primary sources, because there's so many rabbit holes I've gone down and found that the scholar or whoever was wrong, and that thing didn't really mean that. And then there's people like me who misspeak from time to time. So just double check everything. That's my encouragement.
Well, Seth, thank you so much. I definitely down to do a part 3 at some point when you have time and willingness. But yeah, so thanks for coming on, man. Please like this video, subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff, and go check out projecteleazar.com and all that good stuff. All right, see you later.